Hi everyone, welcome. This is National Master Dennis Monokroussos, and tonight we're going to take a look at the 18th place game in the U.S. Chess League's 2007 Game of the Year Countdown. So this game was played between Slava Mikhailuk, who had white and playing for the Carolina team, and Jonathan Schroer, who had black and was playing for Seattle. At least I think that's who was on which team. So if I got that backwards, please excuse me. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look here. Before I go on, let me mention this now, since I'll probably forget if I wait, that I have a blog, and I'd like to invite everyone to check it out. It's at chessmind.powerblogs.com, chessmind.powerblogs.com. Okay, so let's go on with the game here. Enough of the little ad. Alright, so Mikhailuk played knight f3, d5, g3, knight f6, bishop g2, c6, and b3. And this is an opening that's pretty rare nowadays, the Reddy opening, named after Richard Reddy, who's a great Czech player in the first part of the 20th century. I believe he died in 1928. No, 29, I think, is the date of his death. So Reddy was one of the so-called hypermoderns, and the hypermodern idea was that while they agreed with the classical theorists that, of course, it's very important to control the center, these four squares in particular, and the region that's bordered and including the squares that I've just arrowed, so 16 squares by extension. Of course, it's important to control these squares, but you don't have to occupy these squares to control them. So that was the big hypermodern idea, their conceptual breakthrough. And what they would often do is fianchetto their bishops. That's what we call this kind of development here, and allow the other guy to rush into the center, occupy it with all of his pawns, and then undermine it with shots like c4 or sometimes f4 on the other side. And what would often happen, especially in those early games, was that the player that occupied the center would overextend, and their center would just get blown up, and they would lose these horrible games that made for great propaganda for the hypermodern school. So it was a very important breakthrough. Now, nowadays, of course, we realize that you can play both ways. You can occupy the center, you can play this kind of hypermodern strategy, you can play kind of a combination of the two. And alright, so there's no sort of correct way that will always work in every circumstance to try to control the center. But both of these approaches are just standard tools that every good player needs to know about. And how much you can get away with in terms of giving up the center or occupying the center is something that you learn by experience, and it's going to vary from situation to situation. So in any case, as I said, White's idea is to try to attack the center from a distance rather than controlling it by direct occupation. Okay, let me get rid of these arrows here and all the other funny little color, and say something about Black's options in this position. So there are two basic options, and then there's a third choice that Schroer chose, though really this is going to transpose into one of the two. And really one of the fundamental questions here for Black is, what will you do with this bishop on c8? So you don't want to just play e6 and bury it alive. So if you play that, this bishop's going to have a bit of a tough time coming into the game. So generally it either goes to f5 or to g4, and I would say they're about equivalent in value, and it's a matter of taste. So in the bishop to g4 line, sometimes this piece gets kicked around a bit. So for example, bishop to b2, knight b to d7, castles, and here Black has another choice. So he can either swap it off right away with the idea that on bishop to f3 he'll play e5, so there's your central occupation, and he gets rid of his bad bishop. White can play e takes f3. It's an interesting alternative. So that way, if Black does play e5, comes under pressure. So there's the pin, and then he's got to worry about f4, and so that changes up Black's strategy. So instead he's got to play g6 and be a bit more patient. Okay, anyway, that's one idea for Black. Another idea is just to play e6, and you can see both sides consuming their development. And at some point, White is going to try to expand on the king side. So you'll see moves like h3, sometimes g4, usually it's prepared, but he'll look at some point to get this guy going and the e-pawn going. And the bishop black's bishop, his light squared bishop, can often end up under siege. Okay, so for those who want to take care of that, bishop to f5 is another option. So now the bishop won't get kicked around as much. So the idea is, after a few perfunctory developing moves, black plays h6. So the bishop's going to hide back in the corner on h7, and in the process won't be trapped or exchanged off or even victimized for the sake of white's gaining tempi to attack on the king side. Alright, so d3, bishop to e7. You got to be careful if you play bishop to d6, because at some point you may run into something like e4 and e5. So e4 gaining a tempo on the one bishop, and then e5 is a fork. So usually black plays either bishop to c5 or bishop to e7 here. And again, you can have a position like this, and away the game goes. White can sometimes concede with things like queen b2, doubling on the c file, and trying to exchange here. So, very interesting play. Lots of games with this. You can look to your heart's content in the databases and learn a lot more about it that way. Alright, we're going to continue with the game as it took place, and it saw the move a5. Now this might look kind of funny, against g6, or let's say against g3, h5 is not so unusual. In fact, I think we might have talked about that. Maybe it was a chess-based show. But anyway, that idea is kind of common. So you can think, for example, about the dragon Sicilian. So black fianchettos plays g6. This is g6 for those who are not completely hip on their chess notation. Then bishop g7. And white plays h4, h5, and will often try to just mate black in a very direct fashion on the king side. Well, whatever the merits of that plan, it's a very common one. It's a common idea. But a5, well, it's not like white's going to get his queen mated or something over on the queen side. So what's the idea of this? Well, it's to stop white from expanding over there. So white can't play a3 and b4, as an example, not that he's going to. Also, I'd say more to the point, black may at some point just play a4 and swap, and that prevents white from conveniently locating all his pieces over on the queen side. And it's more sort of a waiting move. In some cases, white wants to play a3, and maybe should play a3. So all right, there's a bit of tension over on the queen side. So black may try to play a4 again at a moment where it's inconvenient for white, and white has to figure out what he'll do against that. Will he just let the pawn sit there? Will he swap it off? And if he wants to play b4 to keep things closed, well, he needs to play a3. Okay, well, white castled here. Black played bishop g4, bishop b2. Here, for example, a4 has been played. And we'll see one possible continuation. Notice that black is just kind of maintaining the tension over there. And then after knight b to d2, plays a3. So this is another very interesting idea. The point being that if the bishop goes back to c1, well, it's no longer on the great diagonal. On the other hand, if it goes to c3, well, it's a bit shaky here. And it also blocks the c-pawn too. So black played the very aggressive and forthright b5. And, he may just chase this poor bishop all the way up the board, b4, c5, and so on. And if nothing else, he's grabbing a lot of space in the process. So white played rook to c1, enabling the bishop to drop back. And, okay, it's a reasonable position, but black has a fair amount of space over on the queen side, and is doing pretty well. Okay, again, this doesn't happen in our game, so we won't worry about this too much, about these fine points. Black played knight b to d7. Okay, now here, white can play a3. So again, kind of a prophylactic approach. Oops. So that way on a4 he can play b4. Alright, so this occurred in a game between Rustamov and Volkov, two very strong Russian grandmasters. And just to show a few more moves. So again, e4, the idea of playing e5 at some point. And this is just kind of a normal, ready sort of situation here. Black is fine, went on to win the game, but not because of this position. I mean, it took 83 moves before he won. Alright, so d3 happened, e6, and now we're right back into regular ready theory. White could again play a3, played knight b to d2. Black could again play a4, doesn't happen, plays bishop to e7. Again, white could play a3, doesn't, he plays e4, castles. And now finally this whole a-pawn situation gets resolved. White plays a4. Now, this move, it's, I'm not sure that I like this move especially. Of course it prevents a4. The drawback is that it weakens b4 a bit, especially if white tries to play one of his thematic moves in this kind of formation, which is c4. So here c4 really weakens b4, and the dark squares in general are all kind of weakened with a continuation like that. So I have my doubts about this move. Okay, black played knight e8. Now this is the prelude to a very aggressive idea. I mean, there are a lot of things that he can play in this position. So looking in the database, whoops, black has played d takes e4. That's one thing he's played. He's played queen to b6, which makes sense, putting the queen on a pretty good square and controlling against some of those dark squares, including b4. Black has played the immediate bishop to b4. He's played b5, which comes into contact with the a-pawn, and thereby prevents this rook from really moving sideways, because b takes a4 would create a weakness. Okay, so that's yet another idea. Let me get rid of all of these guys too. Another move that black has played is knight c5, and queen c7, queen to b8. So lots of moves have been played here. Alright, well, what's so special about Schroer's move? Well, I'm not sure that it's the best move, but as I said, it has a very aggressive idea in mind, and we'll see it next move. So queen to e2, and now f5. So this is very aggressive, and maybe even a bit crazy. Now, the drawback of this move is that he's really weakening some squares on the e-file, especially e5 and e6. Alright, but what he wants to do is to be able to open the f-file, or to play f4 and still maybe open the f-file later on. So it's a very, very direct, forthright approach. Okay, now one possible line here, not the game, is h3, and then taking. Move like rook f to e1. So trying to exploit the e-file straight away. But it looks as if black is okay. So here, check, rook f7. Let's say d4, supporting knight to e5. So white looks like he's in really good shape here. Notice that black can't play knight to c7 because it would hang this bishop on d6. But otherwise that would be a good move. He would get to evict the queen. So probably the best move here for black, okay, let's say f4 first, and h4. Okay, so now not only is knight to e5 threatened, but knight to g5 is threatened as well. So here, bishop to b4 is good. So notice this highlights the weakening that I mentioned of this b4 square. If white's pawn were on a3 instead of a4, this wouldn't be possible at all. So here, c3 looks right, but now knight to c7. So there's no bishop hanging, so you can, well, the bishop's hanging, but not to the queen. So this is a free tempo for black. Now bishop to d6, everything's covered, and he's going to follow up with rook to e7. So something like this could happen. And this position is about equal. Both sides are really kind of cramped in a way. I mean, this bishop on b2 is really stupid. This bishop on g2 isn't much better, because even if the knight on f3 moves out of the way, it's still biting on this d5 pawn. On the other hand, black's bishop is biting on white's d pawn, so it's covering these forward squares, and pawn on c3 covers a square, and the bishop on b2 covers a square, and so on. The knights are dominated, again by the pawn on d4 for that knight, and this bishop on f7 can't go to g6 either. So you can see both sides kind of stand badly here in a way. As I said, it's about equal. Okay, so that was just one possibility after f5. Alright, in the game, white took immediately, didn't play h3 just yet. E takes d5, rook a to e1. This move looks a little bit funny, but it's probably right. I mean, whichever rook goes to the e-file, the other rook is going to be pretty much out of a job. So he chose rook a to e1. Black played the nice move bishop to b4. So again, this induces c3. Maybe it's not best, but it's at least a plausible move. But doing so shuts in this bishop on b2. So bishop to d6. So notice, we can go back to here. Black would like to play bishop to d6, but might as well get a little gain out of it first, so threw in that. Okay, white plays h3, and now d4. So it makes the best out of a bad deal with c3. So now what he wants to do is play queen to d3, and then drop this knight in on e5, where it's really well placed. And notice the difference in the pawn structure. White can put a knight on e5, and black can't evict it. He can exchange it, and whether that's good or not will depend on particular circumstances. But black, on the other hand, if he puts a knight on e4, white may be able to play f3 at some point. Okay, not right here, but by the time the black knight gets to e4, that might become a possibility. So that's one of those traditional advantages that white has in a Dutch, for example. The possibility of being able to kick a black knight out of e4 while having the chance to take advantage of the dark squares in the center. Okay, so back to the game. King h8. White continues his plan with queen at d3, and now Schroer plays f4. So he's getting his kingside attack juiced up, while white is trying to keep everything kind of nice and quiet, just about black's positional weaknesses. So knight to e5, knight c7, knight d to f3, shoring up the knight. Black plays knight to f6. So now that white's knight is on f3, he doesn't have anything. He no longer has the possibility of playing, excuse me, f3 to evict a black knight. So both sides have their trumps here. White plays g4. This chases the bishop back to a relatively bad square. Well, not relatively bad, it just is a bad square. Bishop to e8. And it also keeps the f-file closed. On the other hand, whenever you're pushing pawns around your king, it's a good idea to just keep in mind pawns don't go backward. And even if you're safe for the moment with a structure like this, it doesn't mean that you're always going to be safe. So, you know, it's a trade-off issue. White does have probably a slight advantage in this position, and his kingside is safe at the moment, but it's a bit loose. So it's a long-term danger at any rate, if not a weakness. Okay, now white plays c4, and this is a bit provocative, really. I mean, white wants to play c5, and thereby either force black to make this exchange, or to let his bishop go back to an even worse square, an even less impressive square. Alright, the drawback of c4 is that it gives up the b4 square once again. Now, this is a very interesting position, actually. Black has a few interesting moves. I'll just mention one, though. It's knight to e4. So knight to e4 is quite a thematic move, and we'll see how this works. So c5 takes, and now if white plays knight takes e5, which is, again, strategically what he'd like to play, because that knight is just so beautiful there. Okay, now black can play queen to h4, and the play becomes pretty sharp. So I think white can maintain an advantage, though. But it's interesting, and it certainly gives us, I would say, at least a glimpse of a bit of foreshadowing into what's to come. So bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes, knight e6. Now this knight's ready to come to g5. Maybe the pawn goes to f3, and all of a sudden, remember what I said about playing a move like h3 and g4? White's king is starting to look a little bit abandoned, a little bit forlorn. So it turns out that he can't defend, but it's getting close. So rook e2. Okay, now if f3, f3 just knight takes f3. Yeah, because the queen's under attack. Let me just put it on the board. f3, knight takes f3, and because white's hitting the queen and the rook, he has time for this. Though I should be a little bit careful, because queen takes h3. You can't do this because queen takes g4 and then queen takes the rook. But white plays knight to e5, and this seems to cover everything. So maybe there's can't win the knight, but the queen's protected, the pawn's protected, the queen's ready to swing over to g3 if need be, and hey, he's still a pawn up and not in mortal danger. So it's a bit tricky, could be a bit dangerous, but I think he's got everything covered. Also, if black tries to move like queen to h6, maybe bishop to c1 will hold it together, so keeping the knight off of f4. Alright, so that's one idea, and if black plays knight to g5, then f3. So returns the pawn, but strategically, white is in fantastic shape. So knight h3, king h2, queen checks, king here. And really that's kind of the end. So you can play rook to f6, and it looks scary, but after rook to h2, it transpires that black can't really increase his attack to be of any real danger to white. So this is actually a reasonable position for white. You can always play queen e2 and queen g2, or maybe queen to e1 to kick the queen out, and he's clearly better here. All right, so knight e4 is dangerous, but it seems that white can survive that. In the game, Schroer played knight to a6. Now, this move has both its pluses and minuses. The plus side is that this knight's going to get to a very nice b4 square, and as we'll see, the square becomes quite useful as a jumping off point for some other spots. The drawback is that, well, the knight's no longer protecting e6, and as we'll see, that actually matters. So knight to a6. And now here, white should have played knight to g5, I think. So knight to g5, and if black continues with knight to b4, if he stays consistent, then after queen to e2, I think black is in strategically dire straits. So the threat is knight to e6, and if black plays, for example, queen to c8, white plays knight to e6 anyway, because queen takes e6, knight g6, and white wins the queen for 2 pieces. Now, it turns out yet again that things aren't quite so simple, because after rook a to d8, there's the threat to just pick off the queen with rook f to e8. There's the threat of bishop to d3, maybe in some cases the threat of knight to d3. So black actually has quite a bit of counterplay, but it's just not clear that it's enough at the end of the day. So let's say c5. If rook f to e8, white just gives the queen up on d6 and is winning on material. So knight to d3, queen e2, takes, bishop c7, and although it's just a pawn on the old standard queen equals 9, rook equals 5, minor piece equals 3 count, really white's probably winning here, or at least is at least clearly better. I mean, this is not an easy position for black to hold in the long run. White has good chances of breaking through on the queen side with bishop to c3, b4. Well, probably queen to d2 first. And black really doesn't have that substantial of counterplay. I mean, the e-file is fairly neutral, and opening lines on the king side is not going to be easy at all. So, big advantage for white here. So after knight to g5, black probably has to play knight to c7, but then at best, this is just a loss of 2 tempi for black, and white can just continue to build. And then here we have an interesting exchange sacrifice, and I think in this position, thanks to the uber knight here on e5, which can always be replaced by his fellow, white has a clear advantage. Okay, so that, I think knight to g5 would have been the best reply. In the game he played c5, which we mentioned before. Black plays knight to b4, queen e2, and now Schroer doesn't want to waste any tempi, takes right away. Now here I think, again, white should have played knight takes e5, but d takes e5 is quite a tempting move for a couple of reasons, maybe 3 reasons actually. So one is you've now got this passed pawn, it's ready to roll. Secondly, this bishop on b2, which looked like the dumbest piece in the world just a few moves ago, right? So a position like here, this bishop looks like an idiot piece. All of a sudden, after d takes e5, this guy could become a superhero after all. And a third benefit to this move is that maybe this knight comes to d4, and from there it hits e6 and f5, both squares looking quite attractive. So this seems pretty plausible, but as we'll see, it's maybe not the best move. Okay, black played knight to e4, great square for the knight. White played knight to d4. So continuing with his plan, and again hitting e6, hitting f5. Threatens maybe bishop takes e4. So it looks like everything is really under control for white. Okay, but it turns out that it's right around here really that things just go out of control, become completely chaotic. All right, now a normal move would be something like knight takes c5, grabbing a pawn, saving the knight from the double capture on e4, and covering the e6 square. So what more could you possibly want? All right, e6, rook g8, bishop c3. It looks like it's a funny move, but the point is just to get out of the way of this fork. Okay, so bishop to c3, bishop g6, e7, queen e5, and this is just a very, very unclear position. So white's down a pawn, but he's got the bishop here, and this bishop on c3, again, could quite easily become a monster. I mean, so there are ideas like h5 and h6, rook to g5, knight f5, you can just see. Looks very promising for white over there. Now h6 is going to slow down a lot of that, but still, there is a very good chance for white to muster some serious pressure against g7. And the pawn on e7 is quite good too. All right. So that would have been the normal move. Knight takes c5. But instead, Schroer becomes an attacking superhero here and plays bishop to g6. Well, this covers the e4 knight. It puts the bishop back on a good square. The only thing is, it allows knight to e6. And it at least doesn't seem at first like this should be enough for black, but stick around. Queen h4, knight f8, rook f8. And now all of a sudden, if we start to look at this position, things are not so clear at all. So, what does black have on the agenda here? Well, one very obvious move is to play knight to g5. It's not his turn, but if it were his turn, to play knight to g5. So that threatens knight takes h3. It threatens f3. It threatens bishop to d3. And it also maybe threatens knight to d3 or knight to c2. So all kinds of stuff now is coming available for black. And so again, there's f3, there's knight to g5, perhaps both moves, depending on the move order. And white has to be pretty careful. I mean, if he tries, let's say, bishop to f3 to blockade, he just hangs that pawn, hangs the h-pawn. If he plays the pawn to f3, well, knight to g3 is a fork, regaining the exchange, for starters. What else can he play? If he plays queen f3, then knight to d2 is yet another fork. So it transpires, as I used that term earlier, it turns out that it's quite a difficult position for white to keep his material while simultaneously preventing black's main attacking ideas from coming to pass. Now, the best move here is in fact the move that Mikhailuk played. He played e6. So this is very good. It opens this long diagonal, and we'll see there are some neat tactics involving the bishop. And just pushing the e-pawn will either deflect the queen, or, especially if the knight's on g5, blocking the queen's path, it forces the rook away from the f-file and the support of the advance f3. So e6 is quite a good move. And now here we have, I would say, a pretty critical position. Now, the move that was played in the game, f3, is very natural, and it worked out all right. But maybe the best move is this retreat with queen to e7. So it seems kind of disappointing for black to drop his queen back just to handle this pawn. But he does have very good compensation. And after he does regain the pawn, remember, he's only down a pawn for the, or he's got a piece and a pawn for the exchange, which is a pretty minimal material disadvantage. So given how active his pieces are, it may be worth taking that little bit of time out to round up the pawn first before returning to the attack. Okay, so here's a possible continuation. Takes, now queen to c4, trying to hold on to the pawn. Knight to d3, forking the bishop on b2 and the rook on e1. So rook e2 is natural. Now f3, rook d2, and now queen to h4. And all of a sudden the position looks critical for white. I mean, what is he going to do about the threat of queen takes h3? And in fact, I would encourage you to stop the recording at this point and see if you can figure out how white can defend himself against this threat. So the variation is pretty nice, long, and requires some good calculation on your part. So good luck, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so here's how white is going to hold his life together here. So first he's got to play rook takes d3. Alright, now, if e takes d3, queen to d4, threatening mate on g7, so black should play rook to g8, and now king h2. So that's actually pretty simple. This isn't a very complicated line, and white's a little bit better here. The really wild line is after rook takes d3, if black plays queen takes h3. So now we're just threatening the mate right away. Who needs a rook if you're going to get the king? Alright, so white's got to play bishop takes g7 check, king takes, rook to d7 check. Now the king can't go back to h8 because queen to d4 check is going to result in queen to g7 mate a move or two later. So the king's got to go out for a little journey here. King to f6, queen d4, king g5, queen e5, now rook f5. So you don't want to play king to h4 because queen to g3 check forces a trade of queens, and white's probably winning there. Or actually even better, sorry, that's a little bit silly. Queen to h2 makes more sense, no reason to give black the passed e-pawn as well. Okay, so after queen to e5 check, rook f5, spectacular move, is the answer. Queen goes back to h2, takes, and now the king goes back to f6, threatening rook to h5. So the gymnastics aren't over for white just yet. Should play rook to g1. Okay, now queen to h5, and here, of course, white can't trade queens because rook takes h5 would be mate. So this is definitely not what the Surgeon General ordered. So you should play e7, threatening maybe rook takes g6 and then queening. But here, black has a kind of a goofy perpetual. So takes, here, check. And now white's king can escape the perpetual with king to f4, but then he would just be losing on material after this. So he's simply down a piece, and he can't queen. Well, he can queen, but he can't keep the queen. So after this check, white has to go back to h2, and black will repeat as well. Okay, so long variation, and all of that was to say that queen to e7 is probably best. But Schroer's move f3 is very, very natural, and refuting it really isn't easy. And really, the refutation consists of a slight advantage for white. So f3, practically speaking, is absolutely the right move to play. Okay, now in the game, Mikhailuk played e7, as we mentioned before. It's a reasonable idea, trying to divert black's queen, but perhaps the best move is bishop takes f3. And it's hard to believe that white can get away with this, but I couldn't find anything concrete for black. Okay, the most obvious, but I'm sure not the best move, is queen takes h3. And here I think white's pretty okay. So he plays bishop to g2, and after queen takes b3, let's say, f4, and I think here he's just clearly better. So this isn't very good for black at all. He really doesn't have access to white's king side in a meaningful way anymore, and if he were to play something like knight to g3, that doesn't do anything because of queen to e5 with the mate threat on the diagonal. Okay, so queen h3, it's pretty unpromising. Alright, a more interesting try is knight to d3. Okay, knight to d3. Now here, white has a few options, and I think only one gives him an advantage, but let's have a look. Okay, so queen takes d3, again, start with the most obvious move. On this, black plays knight to g5, and here the threat of knight takes f3, the threat of bishop takes queen, taking on h3 guarantees a draw. Unfortunately, I think it only gives him a draw because of e7. So if black plays rook to e8, then bishop to g2, and sorry, not bishop to g2. Let me think about this for a second. Oh, okay. Then you'll play probably, what will we do? Probably bishop takes g7. No, okay. Yeah, I think this is going to be perpetual. Probably still queen to... Oh, okay. Queen to e3 should be the move. Sorry that I'm trying to figure this out on the spot here, but I think I've got it. Yeah, so knight takes h3, king g2, and there's no follow-up. Maybe rook takes e7 could work. So the idea would be that if queen takes, then knight to f4 gives perpetual, except that it doesn't, because king here, knight check, king here. No, okay, yeah, it's still perpetual because you can block that. All right. However, I think white has a better move. After rook takes e7, instead of queen takes e7, bishop takes g7 might be the recommended idea. All right. So the idea is rook takes g7 gives white time for a move like rook to h1. That's winning. Or if king takes, then queen takes e7 is obviously completely fatal. But maybe black can just play king to g8. And queen takes e7 is again perpetual, as we saw a moment ago. Yep. Okay, so looks like that's even a draw too. Alright, but in any case, instead of rook t8, black can just get the immediate draw with knight h3, king g2, or king wherever, knight f4, and so on. Alright, so queen to d3, whatever it is, it's certainly not a winning try for white. Second try, e7 straight away. Alright, so rook to e8, now queen takes d3, knight to g5. Oh, yeah, what do you know? This is, yeah, I just calculated out this line just by transposition of moves. Alright, good for me. I figured out something I'd already figured out. Yeah, and here king to g8 is forced, takes, and perpetual check. Alright, that was kind of amusing. Okay, now here's the third try, and this is actually a useful idea to keep in mind. Sometimes you'll see a combination where there are 3 moves or 2 moves that have to be played, and you see that it doesn't work via one particular move order. Sometimes you should think, well, what if I invert the order of the moves? So let's see what happens on bishop takes g7 check straight away. Okay, so again we've got the same 2 choices. King takes the bishop or king to g8. So we'll start with king to g8. Well, here bishop takes, knight f4, queen e3, and of course the f4 square is covered, so black doesn't have that perpetual mechanism. If he tries knight to g5 to sort of over protect f4, then white plays bishop to g2. Everything's covered. White wins. So after bishop takes g7 check, black should just grab the bishop and hope for the best. Unfortunately, it's not good enough. So queen takes now, knight to g5, queen c3 check. Very useful tempo move. Bishop goes back to g2. h3 is adequately covered. And if bishop to e4, rook e3. So white's pieces on the third rank take care of f3 and h3. And since he's an entire rook ahead here, actually a rook and, sorry, not a whole rook, but a rook and how many pawns? Rook and a couple of pawns for a piece. So very big material advantage, and it's certainly decisive since black has no real way to strengthen his attack. So what this all means is that knight to d3, as flashy and attractive as it appears, isn't good enough. So knight to g5 would be the best move. And now bishop to g2, now knight to d3. Again, bishop to d3 can be met by queen to e5, or maybe e7 and then queen to e5. So knight to d3, this hits the bishop, hits the rook, hits f4, and keeps white's queen off of the e5 square. So pretty useful move. Okay, e7, rook e8. And now queen e3 is interesting. This might be the best move, but king h2 is my main line. And now another couple of choices for black here. Alright, if he tries bishop to e4, trying to really screw in some piece somewhere onto the f3 square, and also threatening knight to f4. Right, so he's really trying to get control over f3, h3, and f4 with this move, and blocking the e-file, so he might be able to take on e7. So it looks nice, but after f4, it's working out pretty well for white. So first of all, by getting rid of this knight, h3 becomes a safer spot. Secondly, if the knight moves away, he can take on e4 if he wants. Third, by pushing the pawn up, now the rook covers f4, and the rook covers f3. So white is in fine shape here. So takes, knight e4. If he plays knight to e takes e1, this doesn't quite work out. F takes g5, and black can take the queen, but white gets something bigger. Kind of unfortunate, but Shows you the value of that pawn on e7. Okay, so probably the best is knight to e4, but still, rook e3, takes, queen d4. And white's up the exchange here, a full exchange. Black has a little compensation, but it's not enough. I mean, white's clearly better, much better. All right, so that was what happens on bishop to e4 here. Okay, if instead black just grabs the rook right away, this is probably best, and I think it ends in a position where white still has a nice edge, but black is at least still alive. So white's probably somewhere between slightly better and clearly better. He's got the bishop pair. The bishop on e5 is especially strong. His king is safe, probably safer than black's king, but his queenside pawns are a bit weak, and the bishop on g2 is underemployed at the moment. So it's not a huge advantage, but it's nice. It's not a position that black should voluntarily enter, let's say, from the start of the game. All right, but this requires an awful lot of accurate moves, and so it's understandable that after f3, especially in time pressure, there's no way that white was going to wend his way towards all of that. So he played e7. Logical move. Black's queen retreated. Bishop takes f3. And now queen takes c5. And this is a bit of a surprising move at first, because we saw how many things that the queen was doing on h4, and so it would be pretty natural to just return her to that square. But I think Schroer made the right choice, and it was a nice example of mental flexibility. So of course it grabs the pawn, but it still took a nice leap of creative thinking there from Schroer to make the decision to take the queen away from the king side. Now, once we look at it, we see that it's actually a pretty good move. So there's some pressure on f2. More directly, there's the threat of knight to g3, taking advantage of the pin and winning the exchange back. And again, just winning the material does have its value too. All the same, I think white would have been a little bit better after takes and then queen to e3. So, both sides, we have a situation with opposite colored bishops. Now, the significance of that is that in a situation where the players are attacking, it's often really wonderful to have opposite colored bishops, because it means, in effect, that you've got an extra piece. The other side's bishop can't do anything to combat your bishop. Now, both sides have some attacking prospects here, but I think white can neutralize black's by playing f3. So after the queen retreats, f3 is coming. Of course, black could play queen to d6. So that way f3 walks into queen to g3. But white just plays queen to g3 first, and after, let's say, queen to d7, then plays f3. So the point is that black's light square bishop can be neutralized, but it's going to be a bit tougher for black to successfully neutralize white's bishop, at least if he's alert. So white's a bit better here. Okay. Instead, though, he rejected the idea of taking that knight, and it's understandable. I mean, again, his king side is a little bit loose, and so you think, well, you want to keep this bishop around to defend squares. But it turns out that black's knight is able to do more damage, as we'll see. So, okay, he played the move h4. Now, this is a bit frisky here, but the idea is to play h5 and h6. But it's a bit of a luxury for white to make a move like that when black has so many beautifully placed pieces, so active and so threatening, really. All right, now the right move here is in fact the move that Schroer played. It's very nice, knight to d3. So let's look at all the things that this does. It attacks the bishop. Of course, it's already defended, but still, it does attack it. It attacks the rook. It puts further pressure on f2. It also has the possibility of knight to f4. And notice, too, that queen takes d3 doesn't win a piece because black has simply knight to g5 in response, with a double attack on this bishop, and, of course, a discovered attack on the queen. Now, this is, in fact, what happened in the game, and Mikhailuk missed his last chance to kick around, though I think he's worse after it. So h5 was probably the best chance, just staying faithful to his original idea. Okay, knight takes e1, rook takes e1, and now knight to g5 is best. Not a hard move to find, but in time pressure, the instinct is always to just move away something that's attacked. Okay, so bishop g2, bishop e4, again trying to screw a piece in on the f3 square. And it's a little bit tough for white to react to that. Probably the best way that he can, though, is with bishop to c1. If he tries h6, black just gives up the pawn, gets out of the way of the fork. And here, white's in a lot of trouble. It's probably losing here. So it's probably best for white to play bishop to c1. So that way, knight f3 is no longer possible. So knight f3 falls to a simple tactic. Well, no, actually, I'm sorry, it doesn't fall to a simple tactic. It takes. Well, okay. Bishop takes. I mean, you can't play queen takes because rook takes, rook e8, and the rook just goes back. But after bishop to f3, at least white has a moment to breathe freely here. Maybe with queen to e7, with some chances for counterplay. So takes, and if this, for example, then bishop to b2, and black doesn't want to play rook to g8 because of h6. So that's cooperative on black's part, but it gives you an idea of what it is that he has to worry about. So the right move after bishop to c1 is to take on g2. But now bishop takes g5. So at least white doesn't have to worry about a knight conking him over the head on f3. So here, and again, white gets a little counterplay with the opposite color bishops. And maybe we could say more generally, the opposite square complex attacking possibility. It's a mouthful, though. So in a position like this, both kings are really a bit vulnerable. I mean, black's up a pawn. It's not clear how much that means. So black should be better, I guess, but this is just anyone's game. I mean, anything can happen in a position like this, especially in time trouble. So the point was that this h5 idea, still trying to make something happen on the diagonal, was probably white's last chance. So in the game, after queen takes d3, knight g5, queen e3, knight takes f3, he's just getting hammered here. And it's not that black is regaining the material or anything, but that white's kingside position is just hopeless. So the knight on f3 and the rook on f8 do a beautiful job of keeping white's queen from getting over there. So f4 is covered. Of course, going across the knight is impossible. Can't go to e5 because of the knight. So that's just really, really bad news. This bishop on b2, maybe it can help via e5, but that's about it. I mean, that's the only piece that can actually help out. The rooks can't. These pawns are too far. As we already saw, the queen's not helpful. So white's lost. King h1, queen d6, bishop e5. So there's the what passes for the cavalry for white. But after queen to d7, the threat to take on g4 is pretty horrible. So again, white makes the only move that he can to try to stay afloat. Rook to g1. Well, he could play queen to c5, but that's just a one mover. So queen c5, king g8, and the problem just presents itself all over again. So rook to g1, and now another very nice move by Schroer, bishop to e4. So he doesn't bother taking either rook, because that knight is worth well more than either of the rooks. But now he's threatening to take a rook for free, and there's nothing that white can really do about it. He's also threatening to grab this bishop too. He's threatening that one. He's threatening that one. Maybe the one on g1 also, not because of the material, but because after king takes, then the queen can come for it. It lasted only took the rook. Game by Schroer, a very creative play.